I am Angela Turner, a 32-year-old woman. Up until a particular Thursday night, I genuinely thought my deadbolts were sufficient to isolate my existence from my mother and father. But I couldn't have been more mistaken. Steering into my driveway, I spotted their silver sedan parked along the curb. Neither parent stepped out of the vehicle or gestured toward me. They simply sat there, waiting for my eyes to land on the gift-wrapped parcel sitting by my front door before they hit the gas. Secured under the ribbon was a small white card containing a 4-word warning written in my mother's distinct handwriting. Don't make a scene. Though leaving it alone was the smart choice. That warning triggered the same old obedience I had felt throughout my youth. Bringing the package into the foyer, I sliced through the ribbon. Resting on top was a picture of my young son fast asleep in his bed. Directly beneath that photo was a spare key to my home. Underneath both lay a bulky envelope bearing the official stamp of a domestic relations lawyer. Snorts. I felt my legs weaken to the point of collapse. Without reviewing another sheet of paper, I immediately called emergency services. A pair of policemen arrived in no time, laid out the items, and warned me to leave everything untouched. Just then, my husband walked through the entrance. Seeing the officers, he froze in place, stared at the unsealed parcel, and lost all the color in his face. "Tell me this isn't what I think," he muttered quietly. "They really went through with it." Hearing those words chilled me even more than the photo, as it meant he was keeping a secret from me. Before I reveal the rest of the items the police uncovered under those documents, or explain why my husband looked as though he'd witnessed an apparition, I want to ask you a quick question. What time does your clock show at this moment? Where in the world are you viewing this, and what is the current weather outside? It's fascinating to track how far my story is spreading. My husband, Mark, immediately became the focus of the room as both officers spun to look at him, and I did the exact same. For a few tense moments, his eyes darted back and forth, unable to settle on either me or the open container. Eventually, he gestured toward the packet, asking if the contents had been pulled out, to which one of the policemen replied in the negative. Gulping, Mark admitted, "About 3 weeks back, her dad approached me with a document. He claimed it was a backup custody agreement to protect Nathan if Angela and I ended up hospitalized at the same time." I turned him down. I gaped at him in disbelief, having never heard a single word about this meeting. Mark went on to explain that my dad, Frank, had confronted him outside his office, speaking in a relaxed, businesslike manner, as if he were simply discussing a basic insurance policy. When Mark pushed for an explanation as to why we would need such an agreement, Frank told him my mother, Nancy, believed my mental health was failing and a reliable person had to be ready to step in. After Mark warned him to leave our family alone, Frank just smirked and remarked, "That choice might not be left up to you." The reason my husband kept this from me was his fear of reopening psychological trauma I had spent years trying to move past. Though resentment welled up inside me, the physical parcel sitting between us was proof that keeping quiet had only provided my parents with the space to advance their scheme. The more senior of the two policemen introduced himself as Officer Ramirez before pulling on protective gloves. Beneath the legal paperwork, he extracted a compact digital voice recorder, a thumb drive, 6 distinct photos, a toy train made of wood, and a stuffed bear that I knew instantly. The wooden toy was the property Nathan, my 8-year-old child. As for the plush bear, it had gone missing 4 months prior, during our final visit to my parents' house. When Ramirez picked it up, a recognizable floral aroma wafted through the air. It was my mother's perfume, the exact same scent that used to hover outside my door back when she would eavesdrop on me. In a sudden, painful flashback, I was 16 again, stuffing university applications under my mattress because Nancy had already decided which college she was going to force me to go to. The memory wasn't a clear sequence, but a heavy tightness in my chest, the sound of a door handle turning, and her voice demanding to know why a loving daughter would keep secrets from her parents. The pictures were even more terrifying. One showed Nathan asleep, a second captured him eating breakfast at our kitchen counter, and a third was shot through the chain, link fence behind his schoolyard. According to the timestamps printed in the corners, this surveillance had been going on for nearly 2 months. In one photograph, a window reflection partially captured the face of the person taking the picture. It wasn't my mother or father, but an unfamiliar man. At that point, Officer Ramirez stopped viewing this as a simple family squabble. He summoned his supervisor, requested a forensics tech, and inquired if my parents had ever held a key to our house. I admitted that Frank had assisted us with installing a new rear entry lock the previous year. Although we replaced the front deadbolt, after going no contact, we had completely overlooked the back door. Mark shut his eyes in defeat, as the terrifying implication hung in the air without either of us needing to speak. The legal packet held a rough draft of a petition requesting that the court award my parents temporary custody of Nathan. While the main document lacked signatures, several prepared declarations were appended to it. These statements asserted that I had skipped doctor appointments for my son, left him unsupervised, threatened members of my family, and experienced erratic mental crises that made our household unsafe. It was all a complete fabrication. A particular page featured a signature resembling my husband's, but as he bent down to inspect it, he stated, "I didn't sign this." Another sheet was a letter supposedly written by a mental health professional I'd never even heard of, outlining fabricated therapy sessions and urging that Nathan be taken from my custody before a preventable disaster took place. The writing was incredibly clinical, professional, and frightening because it was structured to sound perfectly logical. When Ramirez pointed out the audio bug, Mark immediately recognized the device. 8 weeks prior, he had discovered a matching unit tucked under the passenger seat of our vehicle. Attributing it to a carpooling coworker, he later asked about it, but the colleague denied ownership, so Mark had simply discarded it. This specific recorder, however, featured a strip of dark double-sided tape on its reverse side alongside the tag on it read, "Kitchen 2. Without powering the device on, Officer Ramirez secured it inside a plastic evidence bag. "Since this is marked Kitchen 2, there is likely a Kitchen 1 out there," the officer remarked. His words immediately shifted the mood in our house. While awaiting the technician's arrival, the police requested our consent to search for any other clearly visible bugs. Mark and I gave them the go-ahead. Tucked inside the smoke detector pointing directly at our kitchen table, they discovered a miniature camera. A second piece of equipment was mounted behind a hallway vent close to Nathan's bedroom. None of our home Wi-Fi networks were linked to this camera. Because it saved recordings directly to an internal memory card, the person who put it there clearly planned to come back to get the data. Light marks were also discovered by the police around the locking mechanism of our rear door. My mind flashed back to 2 weeks ago, when my mom showed up at Nathan's school fundraiser, grinning as though our estrangement was just some brief disagreement. Before I had a chance to back away, she wrapped her arms around me. Back then, I assumed her goal was simply to make a scene and humiliate me in front of people. But now, I had to wonder if Frank was actually slipping into our house while she kept us distracted outside. Every piece of evidence was systematically documented by the forensic technician's camera. Ramirez pointed out that fake paperwork doesn't automatically show who drafted it, noting that family law documents are often written up without actually being submitted to court. However, he added that the combination of the duplicate key, the snapshots, and the concealed cameras painted a far graver scenario. He cautioned us against contacting my parents, sharing anything on social media, or disclosing our findings to anyone else. After that, he inquired if we had an alternative place to spend the night. Even though Mark's sister had a place across the bay, packing up made me feel like we were handing our house over to them. Nonetheless, I put together a bag for Nathan and another one for Mark and myself. Mark reached out to his sister to have her pick up Nathan from his friend's supervised birthday party, keeping the frightening details off the telephone line. Right before our departure, Ramirez gave me an official receipt for the seized items and posed a last question. "Were your mother and father aware that your husband had a late schedule this evening?" I confirmed that they did. That very morning, Nancy had phoned Mark's workplace, under the guise of verifying a dinner plan. Ramirez glanced back and forth between where the box had been left and the open entryway. "It's highly possible they anticipated you discovering this by yourself," he remarked. Suddenly, the true meaning of the note tucked under the bow became terrifyingly clear. The phrase, "Don't make a scene," was never an admonition to keep my composure. Rather, it was a command to ensure I stayed completely isolated. Just as we walked out the front door, the investigator came out of the hall carrying a third plastic bag. Inside lay a storage card marked with my own name and a date from 6 years back, the very week of Nathan's birth. Sleep entirely eluded me during our stay at my sister-in-law's place that night. I lay awake, imagining a key sliding into our back lock at every creak from the corridor. We told Nathan that we had to vacate our house temporarily due to a plumbing issue. Believing the story, he snuggled into the sofa and asked if Grandma and Grandpa knew our location. Though his inquiry was harmless, it highlighted just how deeply Nancy had managed to entangle herself in his thoughts. After assuring him they had no idea, I remained by his side until his breath fell into a steady, quiet rhythm. From the other side of the room, Mark stared at me, his expression heavy with remorse. Once our son was fast asleep, Mark expressed deep regret for keeping Frank's recent contact a secret from me. I admitted to being deeply hurt, though I conceded that I understood his hesitation. For years, my mother and father had conditioned the people close to us to tiptoe around my feelings rather than challenging their toxic actions directly. That night, we broke that cycle forever. The following morning, we received a call from Officer Ramirez asking us to return to the police precinct. It turned out the storage card dating back to Nathan's birth had not been retrieved from any of the cameras in our residence. Instead, it was filled with digitized paperwork, audio files, and pictures accumulated over a 6-year period. The opening audio track captured a discussion between Nancy and myself in my postpartum hospital room. While I clearly recalled that talk, I had absolutely no idea she was taping us. Pointing out my extreme exhaustion after labor, Nancy had pressured me to sign a temporary power of attorney for medical decisions. I had flatly turned her down. Listening to the file, her voice came across as incredibly sweet and caring. Once I walked out of the room, however, Frank's voice could be heard on the recording. "She'll give in once she understands that she doesn't actually hold any of the cards," he stated. Listening to those words all these years later felt like the ground suddenly giving way beneath my feet. Additionally, the drive held duplicates of our joint tax filings, Mark's employment roster, Nathan's school events, and detailed logs of personal disagreements between my husband and me. The majority of these written entries took mundane household events and spun them into malicious allegations. For instance, a simple rescheduled dental checkup was framed as denying our child health care. When a sitter showed up 10 minutes behind schedule, they documented it as leaving our son completely unattended. They even saved a picture of me enjoying a single glass of wine during a festive meal, labeling it as a sign of addiction issues. My mother and father weren't keeping track of any genuine safety issues. They were actively fabricating a narrative to use against us. At the station, Ramirez brought in Detective Lena Cho, a specialist in stalking and cyber surveillance investigations. She made sure not to guarantee an immediate arrest. Cho informed us that the electronic files required official verification and the recovered cameras had to be traced back to their source. Additionally, she alerted us to the fact that Frank had already contacted the police. He asserted that the container was merely a collection of family memorabilia brought over during a dispute, claiming I was blowing things out of proportion due to my history of psychological instability. To back up his claims, he provided the contact information of a former police captain who would vouch for his outstanding character. This maneuver was so entirely expected that it actually helped soothe my panic. He hadn't phoned to check on my well-being. Instead, he immediately focused on managing the public perception of the situation. To keep us secure, Detective Cho advised us to swap out all our locks, notify Nathan's school to step up security, and file for a temporary protective order. Later that same day, we sat down with our lawyer, Melissa Grant. Upon examining the forged guardianship application, she spotted a detail that had escaped everyone else's attention. Although the credential number listed for the therapist belonged to an actual practitioner, the name printed on the document didn't correspond to the official state licensing board's records. Furthermore, the notary public seal stamped onto Mark's falsified declaration was authentic, though 3 months prior, a theft report had been filed for that identity. It turned out the file was a patchwork of actual people's details, assembled with the expectation that nobody would look too hard. We were warned by Melissa to stay away from my mother and father. She put together a legal demand letter instead, demanding they stay away from our house, refrain from reaching out to us, keep clear of Nathan's school, and stop handling our private documents. Though Mark was eager to deliver it right then, I requested 10 minutes to myself. Sitting by myself in the meeting room, my eyes locked onto the document as my mind drifted back to when I was 22 years old. I was in my parents' kitchen holding an offer of admission for an out-of-state graduate degree. Frank snatched the paper away, creased it twice, and told me that my experimental phases had already cost the family too much. Nancy kept sobbing until I gave up on leaving San Francisco. To save myself from the embarrassment of the truth, I spent the next several years claiming the choice was entirely mine. Yet here they were again, treating my adult life as just another piece of paper they could edit to their liking. I put my signature on the document. Our first big breakthrough arrived later that night, a phone call from Detective Cho. Investigators traced a serial number on the corridor camera to a nearby business that installs security systems. Even though the transaction was done in cash, the shop's security cameras captured a perfect image of the customer. He matched the mystery man seen in the reflection of the school photo. We now had a name: Calvin Rhee, a private detective whose operating license had been put on hold due to allegations of unlawful surveillance. Thanks to an urgent data preservation demand, phone logs revealed numerous calls exchanged between Rhee and a line under Frank's corporate name. Still, Cho cautioned us against getting our hopes up. She explained that phone calls alone did not establish a criminal plot, and Rhee could always argue his assignment was strictly legal surveillance. Furthermore, she disclosed that when police went to his registered place of business, they found it completely abandoned. He had packed up and left the previous night. Nancy left me a voicemail about 60 minutes later, ignoring both the police investigation and the box. She mentioned hearing rumors that Nathan was absent from school and proposed picking him up to stay with her until our lives quieted down. She sounded incredibly sweet, adopting a deeply protective tone. But right before hanging up, she dropped her voice to a quiet murmur and warned, "Keep in mind that the courts prioritize stability, Angela. Do not do anything that makes you appear unstable." Rather than texting her back, I sent the audio files straight to Detective Cho. In that moment, the illusion of my mother as some invincible force shattered. She just sounded like someone reading from a prepared text. Then my phone rang again. It was Melissa. That fabricated emergency request was no longer just a threat on paper. An attempt to submit it had actually occurred earlier that day. This move brought their entire scheme out into the light. After retrieving a duplicate of the filing from the clerk's office, Melissa found out that Frank and Nancy were trying to secure an immediate court order without giving me any prior warning. In the document, they alleged that a family emergency had caused Mark and me to flee with Nathan. They also claimed the authorities had to check on our residence due to my unstable behavior, leaving my parents as the sole family members who could offer a safe environment. They had twisted our report to the police into proof of our own unfitness. To back up these claims, they appended the fabricated letter from the therapist, the forged signature of my husband, tightly cropped pictures, and a written statement by Calvin Rhee, who labeled himself simply as an advisor on family security. Their legal requests sought interim custody, the right to view Nathan's academic history, and the keys to our house. To counter this, Melissa rushed to submit an objecting motion before the presiding judge could evaluate their paperwork. Because of the urgent dangers alleged in their filing, a court date was set for the very next afternoon. While Detective Cho was unable to predict the final outcome of the open police investigation for the court, she did submit a signed statement verifying that law enforcement had seized secret cameras, a copied key, and potentially falsified paperwork from our residence. Additionally, the time records on Officer Ramirez's body worn camera confirmed that the police visit was triggered by our report of these discoveries, rather than any erratic behavior on my part. My mother and father walked into the courthouse looking like they were dressed for a high society benefit lunch. Clutching a file folder to her chest, Nancy was outfitted in light blue. Frank exchanged pleasantries with a pair of lawyers in the corridor and gave a familiar nod to a court clerk. Upon spotting me, his face registered no guilt or fear. Instead, he wore the exact expression of disapproval he used to give me whenever I got a school grade that fell short of his expectations. A brief distance down the hall, Nathan was sitting with Mark's sister. Nancy began to walk toward him, but a security guard intervened, citing our temporary protective order. For a fleeting instant, her facade slipped. Her gentle look evaporated, revealing a chilling intensity underneath. Once we were inside, their lawyer painted a picture of two caring grandparents acting out of deep worry. The storage box was characterized as merely an awkward way to pass on family history, and he argued the photos were taken only to track Nathan's daily schedule out of concern that he was being neglected. The key, he insisted, was simply an old extra that had been mixed in with items they returned to us by mistake. In their narrative, each boundary crossed was framed as loving concern, and every falsehood was spun as a simple mix-up. That was when Melissa presented the unedited pictures, next to the cropped versions in their filing. These original images contained timestamps and a much broader field of view. For instance, a photo they claimed showed Nathan walking unsupervised near his school actually revealed Mark standing just yards away once the cropping was undone. Another snapshot, which they had captioned as me being drunk at a family event, actually depicted a group celebration with half a dozen other guests holding the exact same kind of glass for a toast. The presiding judge demanded an explanation for why the photographic evidence had been modified. While their lawyer asked for a brief moment to speak with my parents, and Frank tried to whisper in his ear, Nancy cut them both off. Rising to her feet, she announced she had an explanation, ignoring the judge's instruction to remain seated until it was her turn to speak. She refused to stay quiet. She argued that I had a lifelong habit of making rash decisions, that my husband lacked strength, and that a responsible adult needed to secure Nathan's well-being. According to her, the family had no choice but to step in before I completely broke down. Taking the opportunity, Melissa inquired if Nancy had given anyone permission to go inside our residence. Although their counsel raised an objection, the judge permitted a brief response since their custody filing requested physical entry to our house. Locking her eyes onto mine, Nancy declared, "When a daughter won't accept assistance, a mother has to take action." While this statement fell short of a full admission of guilt, it shattered the pristine reputation she had tried so hard to project to the court. Inside the courtroom, gripping her arm, Frank demanded that she halt right there. Both the presiding judge and the court reporter caught him in the act. That's when Melissa introduced the audio message where Nancy could be heard cautioning that stability is what a judge prioritizes. Since the message had been delivered straight to my phone by Nancy herself, we bypassed any legal hurdles regarding recording consent. The magistrate played the recording back a second time. Once the audio finished playing for the second time, the judge rejected their petition for immediate guardianship, banned my mother and father from making any contact with Nathan or entering his school grounds, and forwarded the questionable paperwork to the fraud division of the court. Additionally, he decreed that the court would refuse to review any of their subsequent filings unless we were formally notified beforehand. Once we stepped into the hallway, Frank's calm facade completely shattered. He lunged so close to my face that a nearby bailiff had to step in and separate us. "You've crossed a line you don't even understand," he snarled. "We have a reputation here, and everyone is well aware of your behavior as a daughter." Throughout my upbringing, those words would have made me shrink away. This time, however, I looked him in the eye and said, "In that case, let's show them the proof." And Nancy started sobbing, though her face remained completely dry. Turning to Mark, she accused him of standing by while I destroyed the bond Nathan shared with his grandparents. Mark shot back, pointing out that they were the ones who destroyed that relationship the moment they broke into our house. Frank grimaced, asserting that we had absolutely no way of verifying who actually crossed that threshold. "That's exactly what we are establishing," announced Detective Cho, stepping forward from her spot near the elevator bank. Looking around, Frank caught sight of her police shield, and the arrogance immediately drained from his expression for the very first time. Chu requested that my mother and father accompany her to the precinct of their own accord, but their legal counsel quickly interjected with a refusal and ushered them out of the building. Glaring at me with pure venom, Nancy stepped inside the elevator cab. Just before the metal doors slid shut, she pulled out her mobile device and frantically tapped out a message. Within 5 minutes, a text was broadcast to our entire relatives list, asserting that I had experienced a psychological episode, coerced the authorities, and was attempting to put my caring parents behind bars. However, Nancy made a critical error by selecting the incorrect media file to attach to the text. Right below her paragraph of lies was a snapshot of our kitchen counter, captured by their secret camera. She desperately attempted to retract the group chat message, but several family members had already saved the image locally. Before I could even make it to my car in the parking deck, my cousin forwarded me a screen capture of the text. The picture clearly displayed our kitchen area, taken from the vantage point of the lens concealed inside our ceiling smoke alarm. Down in the corner of the frame was a date and time stamp, proving the picture was taken 3 weeks prior to the package showing up. With that one mistake, Nancy had tied herself directly to the spying apparatus she previously claimed was a simple misinterpretation. Detective Chu immediately contacted everyone who received the broadcast, instructing them to keep the raw message intact. Before nightfall, the digital file was under joint review by the district attorney, the court's fraud specialist, and the police department's digital forensics unit. Metadata hidden within the picture indicated it originated from a directory labeled Angela Home Monitoring. Digital footprint records traced that specific folder back to a portable computer owned by Frank's advisory firm. Even though Frank might claim someone else was operating his laptop, his defense strategy was starting to crumble. The very next day, police forces descended on both Frank's business headquarters and my parents' residence to execute search warrants. When Cho updated us later, she carefully restricted her details to what was legally disclosable. During the search, investigators seized spying hardware, an illegally obtained notary stamp, billing records from Calvin Reese for duplicates of our house keys, and a collection of binders categorized by years from my childhood. A particular folder held comprehensive dossiers on Mark's professional life, the people in our neighborhood, the faculty at Nathan's school, and relatives who might potentially take our side or back my parents. Inside another binder were written outlines for unsigned tips meant to be delivered to social services, Mark's supervisors, and Nathan's school administration. Though some of these letters remained unmailed, they clearly illustrated a highly structured plot. The goal was to cut us off from our support network, destroy our reputation, and position my mother and father as the ultimate saviors. 2 days down the line, police tracked down Calvin Ree at a motel located on the outskirts of Sacramento. Confronted with the paper trail linking him to the hidden devices and snapshots, he chose to work with the authorities. He confessed that Frank had hired him to keep our residence under surveillance and set up the recording bugs. Additionally, he revealed that Nancy was the one who supplied our daily timetables and kept us preoccupied at the school charity event. While Ree insisted he drew the line at entering Nathan's bedroom, electronic forensics proved one of his tracking bugs had been active right inside that room. His self-serving explanations ended up giving the detectives even more granular evidence to work with. By the next week, both of my parents were taken into custody. The charges leveled against Frank spanned stalking, unlawful entry, fraudulent use of identity, conspiracy, document forgery, and wiretapping. Nancy was hit with a highly similar set of charges, along with an additional count for trying to mislead the judiciary. Their legal spokesperson issued a public press release, framing the prosecution as a tragic attempt to turn a standard household dispute into a criminal matter. This narrative fell apart within 24 hours when local journalists managed to get their hands on the official judicial order and segments of the open case files. The community fallout was swift and severe. Frank was immediately suspended from the board of directors at the charitable organization he had run for over a decade. A pair of charities scrubbed his name entirely from their upcoming promotional banquets. NY's church board requested that she step down from her duties while her criminal charges were resolved. Former allies who had previously believed her stories began sending us screenshots of past chats where she had pried into our daily routines, our marital status, and Nathan's academic life. Every single thread forwarded to us served as more evidence of their systematic tracking. I took zero pleasure in watching them get publicly dragged, as I was still trying to wrap my head around how massive and complex their spying operation really was. With Melissa's guidance, we launched a civil lawsuit seeking damages for trespassing, severe emotional trauma, privacy violations, and the financial toll of fortifying our residence. We completely overhauled our life, buying brand new lock sets, surveillance cameras, PCs, and cell phones. Mark altered his professional daily schedule. The administration at Nathan's school placed my parents' pictures in their security system to prevent them from coming near him. While the overall bill was staggering, each protective measure we implemented brought us a sense of safety and separation rather than anxiety. Prior to her day in court, Nancy secured pre-trial release under incredibly tight restrictions. The judge banned her from reaching out to us through any means, whether in person or via third parties. Frank had to surrender his travel documents to the court and was legally prohibited from logging onto any business-related hardware. They continued to use extended family members to relay messages claiming their behavior was purely motivated by affection. Every time this happened, I offered the exact same retort. Real affection never involves falsifying legal signatures, planting spy equipment, or copying house keys without permission. After 3 weeks passed, a bundle of flowers was delivered to the residence of Mark's sister. It was missing, the envelope arrived without a sender's name, containing a simple card that stated, "Families forgive." Detective Cho dug into the transaction history and linked the purchase to a prepaid card. Then pulled the retail store's surveillance video to find Nancy herself completing the transaction at the counter. Because she had openly defied the active restraining order, Cho took her back into custody that very afternoon. When the judge threw out her bail, the deputies marched her out of the courtroom, and our eyes met across the crowded lobby. There were no tears or fake excuses this time. Instead, she quietly shaped her lips to deliver a silent accusation. "You did this to us." That was the exact moment I realized how different guilt is from responsibility. Their downfall wasn't my doing. I had merely stopped stepping in to shield them from the fallout of their own choices. It took 3/4 of a year for the criminal proceedings to run their course. Throughout those 9 months, my mother and father exhausted every procedural loophole to stall the trial. Frank fired and hired defense counsel twice. Nancy claimed she required special medical arrangements for court. Yet she was spotted mingling at local parties, loudly insisting to guests that the legal battle was ruining her physical well-being. Friends and allies submitted character statements to the court, painting them as upstanding, charitable figures who lived solely for their family. To dismantle this narrative, the state's attorney presented concrete evidence, pictures of the spy equipment, financial receipts, falsified paperwork, and the text sent by NY that featured the captured surveillance photo. But the most devastating revelations came from the organizing binders seized during the police search of their residence. Frank had spent decades archiving correspondence meant for me, including the official admission folder for a graduate program I always assumed I had passed on. Tucked inside was another document offering me financial assistance in response to my deferral request. A letter I was never allowed to see. It turned out Nancy had phoned the university, posed as me, and officially canceled my enrollment for good. In a different file, we discovered messages Frank had fired off to an old boyfriend of mine, warning him that my mental state was fragile and that staying with me would destroy his professional future. Their campaign of manipulation didn't start with the birth of my son. They had merely scaled up an oppressive structure they had been running since my childhood. My attorney, Melissa, inquired if we should add these discoveries to our civil lawsuit. I agreed immediately, not out of any illusion that the legal system could hand back my stolen career paths, but because I refused to keep maintaining their fabricated family timeline. Mark stood by me as we reviewed the mountain of paperwork, which left me swinging between intense rage and complete emotional numbness. What hurt the most was reading my mother's journals and seeing my own self, doubt mirrored in her writing, phrases about me being too fragile, too reckless, and far too helpless to handle my own life. I realized I had spent my entire adulthood describing myself using the very labels my mother had assigned to me. When it came to our son, we kept the details strictly age-appropriate. We explained to Nathan that his grandparents had broken some very major rules, that the grown-ups were sorting it out, and made sure he understood he had done absolutely nothing wrong. When he asked if they still loved him, I told him I thought they felt an emotion they believed was love, but that when love lacks respect, it turns into an attempt to own someone. After a long silence, he whispered that he just didn't want people photographing his bedroom window anymore. This quiet request was written directly into the victim impact statement that Melissa assisted us in drafting. As the court date drew near, Calvin re-agreed to take the stand for the prosecution. Digital analysis proved his tracking gear had been brought inside our home on multiple occasions, while cell tower data placed Frank in our immediate neighborhood during 2 of those break-ins, and NY's text history showed she deliberately distracted us during the intrusions. Investigators matched the fabricated therapist documentation to a template saved on Frank's computer. Mark's falsified signature had been traced back to an old home renovation contract, and the missing notary stamp was found hidden inside a locked drawer in NY's craft room. Confronted with an overwhelming case, both parents decided to bypass the trial and sign plea deals. Frank admitted guilt to a list of felonies including home invasion, stalking, conspiracy, and document forgery. Nancy pleaded guilty to stalking, conspiracy, attempting to mislead the court, and breaching her restraining order. During the sentencing hearing, Frank attempted to use his civic contributions to gain leniency, but the judge pointed out that violating his position of public trust actually made his actions far worse. He was handed a multi-year sentence in state prison, with supervised parole to follow. Nancy was sentenced to time in the county jail, strict probation supervision, compulsory psychological therapy, and a permanent order of protection, keeping her away from our family. In addition, the judge ordered them to reimburse us for every dollar spent on legal counsel and home defense upgrades. The illusion of their wealth vanished almost immediately. Frank's firm shut down after its primary accounts walked away, and their insurance company denied coverage for the civil damages because their behavior was deemed premeditated criminal activity. In order to clear their court fees, make the restitution payments, and fund our civil settlement, they were forced to put my childhood home on the market. The charitable board expelled Frank from his position for good and mailed a formal apology to their financial supporters, while Nancy found herself completely cut off from the local socialites she had spent years manipulating with her fabricated family narratives. Right before she was led away on the day of the sentencing, she leaned in my direction and hissed, "Was ruining everything really worth it?" I looked back and said softly, "I didn't break anything. I just lifted the lid." We have not spoken a single word to each other since. A year later, the sense of constant surveillance had faded from our home. We put in a new rear entryway, mended the duct in the corridor, and swapped out the kitchen smoke alarm 2 separate times, before I finally stopped throwing anxious glances at the ceiling every time I walked in to cook. Moving past the trauma wasn't a sudden breakthrough, but a collection of quiet shifts. It meant leaving my mobile phone on the kitchen island without obsessively checking notifications. Watching my son walk through the school doors without searching the surrounding cars for threats. And having normal marital arguments with Mark without my father's grim predictions of our divorce echoing in my mind. We also worked hard to mend the communication gap in our relationship. Mark swore he would never try to shield me by hiding the truth again, and I committed to letting him know whenever past trauma was bleeding into my current choices. Our decision to go to couples therapy had nothing to do with the fraudulent letter they had mocked up, rather. It was because we wanted a partnership built on transparency, choice, and actual responsibility. Drawing that line was essential for me. My mother had tried to weaponize my psychological well-being, so I was determined not to let her make the act of seeking guidance feel like a mark of shame. The payouts from our civil lawsuit settled our remaining home safety debts and established a college savings plan for our son. Because I didn't want to view their money as some sort of windfall, we chose to look at it strictly as a form of rebuilding what they had broken. The settlement terms also forced them to hand over every single snapshot, audio or video file, spare key, and piece of paperwork related to our lives. Under Detective Cho's direct supervision, a dozen boxes of these items were delivered to us. I chose to leave the vast majority of those containers taped shut. Melissa set up an appointment with a digital forensics firm to sort through the files, preserving what we needed for our documentation while erasing everything else. They sent back a single small envelope containing my genuine acceptance letter to graduate school. For several minutes, I just stared at the paper in my hands. Though its borders had turned yellow with age, my name remained perfectly legible. At 33 years old, I submitted an application to a nearby master's program in that very same discipline. As soon as the confirmation email came in, Mark and Nathan listened to me read the good news out loud. This time, nobody snatched the document away from me. Our relatives responded to the situation in various manners. A few offered apologies for having trusted Nancy's version of events. Others claimed they preferred to stay out of it, treating fabricated legal papers and secret surveillance devices as if they were just a simple difference of opinion. I chose to no longer debate these relatives. My parents had always thrived in that exact kind of passive neutrality. I decided that anyone expecting me to downplay reality just to maintain a quiet household had no business being close to me anymore. Later on, Nathan questioned if his grandmother and grandfather would ever be part of his life again. My response was that the restraining order would stay active, and we, along with licensed therapists, would talk through his emotions with him once he grew older. I refrained from encouraging him to harbor resentment toward them. Feeling bitter would only allow their influence to persist in another way. My goal was to teach him about proof, healthy limits, and how letting go of anger is not the same as letting someone back into your life. While pardoning someone is an internal choice, regaining entry into your life is a privilege that has to be proven. Certain individuals view the outcome as a form of retaliation. It makes perfect sense to me that Frank ended up losing his career, his house, his standing in the community, and his liberty. For Nancy, the consequences meant losing her position in society, her grip on our relatives, and the group of listeners who used to believe her every word. Even though their downfall was devastating, I didn't fabricate any clues, distribute gossip, or orchestrate their ruin. All I did was save their messages, notify the authorities of their actions, and stand firm when they attempted to gaslight me. The reality of the situation finally brought about the accountability they had successfully dodged for decades. Until the legal proceedings wrapped up, the packaged parcel stayed locked away in the police department's storage room. Once the items were returned, the only thing I requested to keep was that cautionary note. I placed it inside a frame right next to my admission letter to the university. Those written words, instructing me not to cause a public disturbance, now sit directly under the evidence that I took back control of a life path they had previously taken away. That phrase has lost its power to command me. Instead, it stands as a monument to the very second I stopped complying. Consequently, this is the takeaway I walked away with from that threshold. Whenever manipulative figures demand your silence, they are usually just guarding the narrative that keeps them in charge. Keep a record of reality, seek external support, establish firm limits with real repercussions, and never equate obligation to relatives with a license to violate your personal space. Faced with that package, would you have unwrapped it yourself? Or would you have contacted law enforcement before making physical contact? No matter your choice, pay attention to that transition where supposed worry shifts into domination. Recognizing that shift might mark the very start of your liberation. We appreciate you tuning in for another narrative on this channel. All content presented here is designed purely for purposes of contemplation, instruction, and amusement. Our goal is to show you that recovery accelerates when you quit assessing your growth based on their remorse, and instead gauge your progress by the sheer tranquility you enjoy in their absence.